It's time for Political Buzz, the television forum to discuss politics and issues of interest for all of Western New York. Now, from the WBBZ television studio at the Eastern Hills Mall, this is Political Buzz.
Hello, everyone. John DeShulo with you here. Phil Arnold joining me as co-host for this particular program. An important half hour coming up. We need you to stay right here on your hometown television station. It was just recently that 298 souls were lost as a plane was shot down, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, blown out of the sky recently over rebel-held territory by a Russian-made surface-to-air missile, crashing, ironically, into a field of sunflowers in the Ukraine. Now, as the world reacts, the blame game is played, and Russian President Vladimir Putin is admittedly scrambling. We welcome one of Western New York's most important political strategists, not only for his opinion on what has happened, but also because he has lived for several years and has advised political candidates in Russia and the Ukraine. Michael Caputo, who is with us on the show, and of course, Phil, we recognize you as executive producer and co-host. And Michael, I have to say, what was your reaction when you heard of this and reading into the fact that it was something that was a direct hit?
Well, it was predictable. It was absolutely predictable when you consider the fact that Russia has been sneaking Russian soldiers in nondescript green uniforms into Ukraine across that porous eastern border for months now. They've been arming them with the most sophisticated weaponry that's available on Earth today. And they were shooting down planes in that area for about 2 weeks beforehand. It was an inevitable situation when you arm people who can't handle the weapons that are in their hands. Accidents are going to happen.
It seemed like President Putin there had some mojo going. The Olympics were held recently. He was full of bravado during that time, and then the Crimea situation happened, and now he's got this. Do you think this is going to set him back politically? I mean, the world is obviously not happy at all with how it's what happened, and worse yet, how it's been handled.
You saw the cover of Newsweek that just came out. It's a picture of Vladimir Putin with fire coming out of his eyes, and it calls him a pariah. He is now a global pariah. There's no question. Nobody believes that it wasn't the Russians that did this. Nobody believes that the Russian separatists aren't behind it, and nobody believes that the weapons aren't Russian. Nobody does. And yet Vladimir Putin looks into the camera on ORT, the official television station in Russia, and lies right to the camera. Every single time, looks at the camera and tells bold-faced lies. The thing you have to understand is that that's been going on in Russia for a century. And it's not going to change now just because they made a grievous error. And another thing you have to understand is, he was building momentum. Sochi, if you remember, started out badly. There were stories about how the hotels and the wild dogs were not fit for an international event. And then it turned into something quite good for the country. So after it happened, after the end of the Olympics and the Ukraine kind of brief revolution in Maidan Square happened, he saw it as an opportunity. And Vladimir Putin is, if nothing else, a man who takes advantage of opportunities. And by the way, these are opportunities that are being presented by an international arena and by a president of the United States who can't handle them.
I think the point is that no matter what the world thinks, it doesn't affect Putin. In his position, with the power that he commands, nothing is really affecting him. Is that correct?
That's true. Vladimir Putin doesn't care about public relations. He cares about it inside his own country. And he believes, and his rankings are still high.
But he can control that.
Absolutely, because he controls the media 100%. I did public relations for the Kremlin in the 90s. And when I returned to the United States in 2000, I was helping Boris Yeltsin's team in the Kremlin convince the West that taking over certain elements of the media in Russia was necessary because they were being controlled by criminal oligarchs. So I spent time working with them, developing their message, taking them on a national tour in the United States. That was under Yeltsin. The new Kremlin, the Putin Kremlin, doesn't give a hoot what you think in the Netherlands, the United States, and certainly not Buffalo.
That being the case, and with what you know about the politics of the area and the people, both in the Ukraine and in Russia, where do you see this going? Best case scenario, worst case scenario?
I think best case scenario is Putin they put Putin back in the jar, tightened it down a little bit, and he rides out his tenure in the Kremlin in shame. That's the best case scenario. You're not going to see him run out of the Kremlin under any circumstances. Because remember, Putin is the most powerful individual in Russia, but he represents what they call the party of power. The senior most dangerous, most influential leaders of the defense, military, intelligence services, and criminal gangs and oligarchs. They all support Putin, so he represents them. Those people are not going to turn against Putin because they don't care how many people he's killed. In fact, some of them probably want him to kill more. If the best thing that could happen is he just goes quietly in the end. The worst thing that could happen is this is going to turn into a full-blown war, and it's going to drag the international community into it because Putin refuses to be embarrassed.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because just before we recorded this show, the Ukrainians are saying that 2 jets were down by missiles fired from Russia.
Military jets.
Military jets, is correct. So what is the core of the conflict? What is going on, for the audience that doesn't maybe grasp that, between Russia and the Ukraine? Mm-hmm. Why is there conflict there, and why might that continue to escalate?
Russia has always controlled Ukraine. Even after the wall fell and Ukraine became independent, they controlled the president there all the way through time. And the president that was there during the time, during the Maidan Square protests, Yanukovych, was his puppet. So as soon as his puppet was removed, he had no control over anything. And remember, Crimea is their only warm water port, and it's the most important naval base they have in the world, and they were leasing it from Ukraine. An absolute embarrassment just to begin with, because Crimea was a part of Russia for hundreds of years. Russians were in Crimea when George Washington was working for the British. So the fact that they had a power vacuum, their man was run out of town, was hiding actually in Russia, gave them the opportunity to go in and say, you know what? There's destabilization going on. Let's get Crimea. They took it. They'll never give it back. The problem we have now is that they have an insatiable appetite. It's like potato chips. You can't eat just one. And the Russians want more. And particularly Putin wants more, because he in his heart wants to reconstruct the Soviet Union. This accident, I want to say, this tragedy, this horrific abuse of power has put Putin in a box. But let me tell you something. In Russia, they think it's the United States and Ukraine that have done this. And there's a conspiracy theory that's growing in Russia right now. I talk to Russia on the phone every day. Some of my greatest friends, people who I respect, who are liberals and with a small L, pro-reform Democrats, believe that the United States and others have created this problem for Russia.
And they believe that because Putin controls the message?
Controls the media 150%.
And this is getting off topic slightly, but if the leadership in Washington was stronger, if they had a better foreign policy, would we be experiencing the same situation?
You have to look at Russia like a pack of wolves. I mean, I know my daughter's Russian. I have very good friends, people I love in Russia. We have to look at them as a pack of wolves, and the rest of the world is sheep. And the only time the wolf attacks the sheep is when the shepherd is asleep. That's the only time it ever happens. In America, and by the way, in Europe, the shepherd is asleep, and the wolf is running wild.
If we were to be more energy independent, I know Europe is very hesitant to get involved because they get their oil supply, their energy supply through Russia, and that puts Russia at an advantage in this situation. If we had more energy independence strategically, we'd be able to make a difference?
Well, there is Ukrainian natural gas. There's oil that doesn't reside on Russian soil. One of the things the United States should do is help Western Europe with their energy independence. They're very, very dependent on oil and oil products from Russia. They fear offending them because their price goes up the next day. It always does. And the best thing the United States can do is help them build the pipelines and the access routes and all of the infrastructure they need to stop their absolute dependence on Russia for keeping their homes warm.
Nothing like this is happening, though, right now.
No, I believe that as incompetent as the Obama administration is, I believe that the State Department is talking to Western Europe and certainly EU about this kind of programming, because Netherlands is a very powerful partner in the European Union. They are absolutely out of their minds upset about this, and they also believe that energy independence is one of the first and most important things that should come out of this.
We're going to wrap up this segment in a minute or so. One last question. For the average viewer out in Buffalo, New York, watching this program, how is this affecting them, or is it affecting them? Should we care?
Well, I mean, there's a legitimate stream of thought that says, unless you're a vodka drinker, this doesn't affect you. But I don't agree with that. I think that a shooting war has broken out. Ukraine, when they broke away from the Soviet Union, they became independent. The West opened their arms. I was there when it happened, and they said, "Please come to us," and they came. And then we let them get hijacked by Russia. The problem we have right now is that the European Union isn't powerful enough, and as a group or individually, to embrace Ukraine in the way that they need to. The people in Buffalo need to know one thing. If this continues to go in the direction that it's going, their children will be going to war.
That's a good point. That's one of two things that I had anticipated as an effect on this area. One is, you know, if you've got kids around, the world is a very dangerous place, and going forward, whether it's the Middle East or whether it evolves in Russia, your kids might be at risk to be sent into harm's way. The other more immediate effect to Western New Yorkers is, with the instability, the price of energy is going to go up. It's going to cost you more today to put gasoline in your car.
That's probably true. I mean, the instability is like the butterfly flapping its wings in China and causing a storm all the way in America. Everything is connected now. Right. The Middle East will take advantage of this and raise the prices. We'll have higher prices at the pump. But in reality, it's a security threat. One that we could really, if we had leadership, if we had strength in the White House and some resolve in Congress, it's something that we could help solve.
Okay, we'll wrap this up. We'll be back shortly after these messages. Welcome back to Political Buzz. Phil Arno here with my co-host John DeSciullo and Michael Caputo. Michael, before we left, we showed a picture here. Tell us a little bit about that photo.
That was actually the day, my first day at work, my office by the Kremlin, in the Kremlin. The night before, there had been a news report as I was arriving, that Americans were going to be taking over the Kremlin's campaign and political strategy, and that was a protest against me and against that. And I walked outside not knowing, and they didn't know I was walking outside. At the time, I smoked cigarettes. I went out to have a cigarette, and I walked right in the middle of the protest, and they didn't recognize me.
The culture of the Ukraine and the people that are there, talk to me about how what their world is like. You know, are they an oppressed people? Is there, you know, when they saw the plane come down, their bodies were coming into their villages. I mean, what is it? What is life like there?
There was
to equate it to the modern world that we are familiar with.
There was a remarkable story in Reuters, written by a Russian language, a Russian editor of Reuters, but written in English. It was tragically beautiful, talking about the bodies raining down and talking about them falling into villages and through a roof of a woman's cottage. And, as you mentioned at the opening, into these beautiful fields of sunflowers. Now, understand that except for Kiev and the inner cities around the country, the whole place is sunflowers. It's beautiful. I mean, it was considered the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. And the produce and the farming that goes on there, the agriculture that goes on there is fundamental to the entire region. Their exports are tremendous. The people there live a lot like the rural areas in the United States. They are oppressed, but they're economically oppressed. They're not really truly politically oppressed. I think there are some minorities that have problems there. I mean, there's a legacy of anti-Semitism in the former Soviet Union, but the people there are free. They just can't afford to be free. And a lot of that is because of the corruption that's endemic in the entire region. And by the way, the oligarchs of Russia control the oligarchs of Ukraine because they do business together, and the corruption goes all the way back to Moscow. So they don't eat as well as we do. They don't live as well as we do, but they're a robust and wonderful people. I mean, I married one of them. They're so wonderful.
Yeah.
You know, I worked in an election there. They're very creative folks. And the problem I had in the election is I speak Russian. I don't speak Ukrainian. Similar languages, but I don't speak Ukrainian. I would get into a taxi cab and try to tell the guy where I was going in Russian. He refused to speak to me in Russian. They don't want to speak Russian because they remember the 7 million people who were murdered in the Holodomor, which is the famine that was orchestrated by Stalin, where a large sector of Ukrainian society died of starvation. My wife's grandmother, she was selected by lottery of some sort to be eaten in the village where she was living.
Good. Nice.
And she managed to get away and hide for days until they finally found somebody else to eat.
So what do these people face? Are they able to really face up to Russia and fight them, or they're just going to have to just take whatever cards are dealt them?
Well, what Russia is gambling on, and I think they may have a problem with that bet now, is that the West won't get involved. I fear the United States getting too deeply involved because it'll be a shooting war that will never end. It'll be like the Cold War and go on for decades and decades. But we also have the problem where Ukraine can't defend itself. I think the European Union is more contiguous, they have what we call in diplomat speak, it's their sphere of influence geographically. But right now we have the pariah, Putin, who was running roughshod over it, basically shipping weapons in with impunity and standing there and pretending like it didn't happen. Vladimir Putin is absolutely lying through his teeth. He's a liar, and he won't stop. The thing we have right now, though, is we have a chance for the West to step in and stop his chicanery.
When the Soviet Union dissolved, there was a system put in place with term limits, and Putin basically figured out a way to get around the rules. He's in there to stay. Is there any, I mean, do you predict that he'll be in there forever until he dies, or is there a way that he's going to leave the scene? Well,
I was actually one of the co-writers of the Russian election law. It doesn't resemble.
So we blame you then.
Yeah, you have to. It doesn't resemble the first draft that we wrote. It was lobbied to death by the people who have an interest in the campaign finance violations. But Putin will be there as long as he wants to. And there's an important thing to understand. The Russian people don't want a milquetoast leader. They don't want a nice guy. They don't want a Barack Obama who's good in crowds and affable and nice to people. They don't want that. In Russia, they have the concept they call Haizian, which I always pronounce incorrectly. Haizian, the big boss, the strong boss. They like strong bosses. So, I mean, as someone who worked at the Central Election Commission, the Russian Federation, these elections are largely fair. But the law is written in a way that he can come back as often as he wants. And the concept of the Haizian in the Russian society guarantees that a guy like him will always be in charge.
Let's talk about the plane and the tragedy in the Netherlands and the world reacting. How can the world, any leader, whether it's from the United States or any place, really think to go into that situation and risk the lives of the people they're sending in? And what are they really going to find when they get there? It's already been tampered with to the degree where I don't know what they would be able to. I'm sure they could put together, you know, the proof and the reconstruction of the plane as they could with whatever is left. So, you know, we talk about President Obama and his reaction to it. Maybe some are saying it's too soft and not strong enough. But are his hands tied, and others from other countries, are they tied too?
Well, if he wants the flexibility that he promised Russia before the election, he's got a problem. His hands are tied if he wants the flexibility. But frankly, I think right now, I'm not one of the big critics of the administration on this because it's not in our sphere of influence, Ukraine, not directly. It's a world problem, a global problem, so we need to participate. But for the United States to stand up and point fingers, when we shot down an Iranian airline in 1988, we don't really have a high pedestal to sit on. But the fact that Putin continues to lie, that he continues to obfuscate, that he continues to try and stymie the investigation, that's going to make it worse and worse for him.
When you have a a leader that doesn't take control and do the backroom politics, basically. Ronald Reagan was very good at behind-the-scenes politics. George Bush Sr. was very good at behind-the-scenes politics. He could get countries to cooperate without going public. He could say, basically, if you do this, we'll reward you this way, and if you don't, it's going to be very, very hard on you. Without that kind of maneuvering, and it seems like this administration doesn't really have a clue about how to get the world to come together. Without that, where do we go? I mean, how do we get control of the situation?
Well, I think America will continue to lead from behind, as Barack Obama.
But that's not leading.
No,
that's
it's
following.
not at all.
I mean, let's call it what it is.
It's not.
That's putting yourself behind everyone else.
Well, I just hope. I hope this situation does not explode. It does not get completely out of control before America elects a new president. I know from my trips to Russia during the Obama administration, from meeting with Russians and talking with Russians on a regular basis, that they think the White House is a joke. And once you've lost the attention of not just the right-wingers and not the communists, but the center in Russia, the liberals, the reformers who think that Obama is an empty suit, once you've lost them all, you're never going to be able to change their mind again. Basically, we have to wait for President Obama to be replaced by someone who can handle the Russians with a firmer hand.
In that part of the world, Russia and Ukraine, correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't there nuclear weapons all over the place?
All over. All over. In fact, I worked for a presidential candidate and then gubernatorial candidate over there who was a general. His name was Alexander Lebed, and we were flying around in Siberia on a campaign trip in this big, huge Russian helicopter. And he told me that he was in charge of the tactical nuclear weapons, the suitcase nukes. And after the wall came down, there were 18 missing. 18 missing. We have thousands of nuclear weapons and warheads in Ukraine and Russia. And they are absolutely out of control. Out of control. So for us, and one of the reasons why the administration tries to stay a little bit close to the situation is because Russians keep telling us, oh, we'll cooperate with you in destroying these nuclear weapons. So they keep giving out these little pieces of candy. We keep lapping them up, and therefore we're not going to make them angry because we want to make sure that we destroy all the warheads. Well,
that's another concern that we should all have. When you introduce chaos into a situation where there's such a powerful weapon, I don't want to get into our immigration, that's a whole different story, the southern border, but when it's so easy to get into this country with something as small as a suitcase nuclear weapon, I mean, the scenarios are unthinkable.
Well, those suitcase nuclear weapons were a problem for a time, and I think most experts now say they're still missing. They've never come out. They say that they've now aged to the point where they're less volatile, and probably most of them dead.
But still the trust factor, that if we can't trust these people to do the right thing, period,
right,
how can we trust them at any point?
And by the way, they didn't stop building them, so they have some new fresh ones. And they're about as secure as the ones that they lost.
So I was going to mention Ronald Reagan because I'd heard on a conservative radio talk show that Ronald Reagan built a lot of his hubris on the Cold War and bringing the wall down and really standing up to the Russians. And is that the kind of leader that the Russians are going to look for on our side to stand up to them? If as you said, the Russian people want to see a strong leader.
Well, there's no question that Ronald Reagan drove the Soviets from power.
And are we headed for that kind of a Cold War scenario again? It certainly feels like it.
Well, I'll tell you, all the Russians I knew, even the communists I knew, thought Ronald Reagan was a great president. And one of the things that was great about Ronald Reagan is he inspired confidence here at home. And until we have a leader who can inspire confidence in America over Russia, this is going to continue to be a terrible problem for all of us.
I'll let Phil have the last word.
Okay, interesting discussion. We'll be back after these messages to continue and wrap up. Welcome back to Political Buzz. We've run out of time on this segment. We thank Michael Caputo, our guest. Mike, there's all kinds of things that I'd love to talk about. Cuomo, the Obama administration, the local politics here in Western New York. You got to come back.
I'd be happy to. Thank you very much.
And we'll listen to Michael. You've been filling in on WBEN. You're doing a great job.
Thank you.
News Talk 930. We wanted to thank our hometown fans that showed up at the Canal Fest Parade recently. We were out there with our MASH Jeep, as we call it. Bob Kaczynski, our GM. Of course, Phil Arno, our owner, his daughter Anna. And we had a great time seeing all our friends in the Tonawandas with another great hometown summer event. WBBZ happy to be there, and we will be hopefully next year. And our next big event will be the Erie County Fair coming up this August. That will do it for this edition of Political Buzz. We thank you for joining us Thursday at 9 a.m., Sunday at 11 on your hometown television station.